This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. And this one comes from Sila. And Sila asks a question that is very pertinent these days when we hear both about mass shootings across the United States literally every day, and we also hear about escalating police violence against unarmed and non dangerous people. Not to say it's justified under any circumstances. I want to talk about it because it's such an urgent issue. But Sela's question goes kind of back to the origins. She asks, as it's good that she does, what are the social conditions? And she particularly wants to know what the links might be between so called austerity policies on the one hand and excessive policing on the other. And I think the link there is clear, and this question gives me a chance to try to spell it out. Okay, first, what are austerity policies? These are policies of a federal government, the government in Washington, the government in London, the government in Paris, and so on. Policies called austerity because they involve cutting back on public services. When the government cuts back, typically across the board, on public services, all kinds of social consequences follow. Now, why do governments do it? Typically because they feel the pressure to balance their budgets. They worry that they're spending more than they're taking in taxes. So, for example, in the years after the economic crash of 2007 and 8, where many governments rushed in to spend money because millions of people were without work, millions of people were without income, and something had to be done to help them. And the government came in, spent a bunch of money, didn't raise taxes, had to borrow the money they spent, but they helped people in the urgency and the immediacy of the crash. Those last 4 months of 2008, particularly, and into 2009 and 10. But when that crash was over, 2010-11, or at least partly alleviated, then the usual politicians began wringing their hands. Oh my, we have spent a lot of money. We had to borrow because we didn't dare raise taxes. And so now we've got to kind of get the budget back to where it was. So we're not going to spend a lot of money the way we had maybe hoped or planned. And so we're going to cut back. And there's the austerity. In Europe, they're honest relative to the United States about such things. So it's called austerity. Here in the United States, it's more likely to be called fiscally prudent policy. In other words, build back up our budget and cut the spending. Now, of course, if you understand what a budget is, there are always alternatives. There are always other things you can do. For example, for the pandemic in the last 3 years, governments spent a ton of money to try to cope with the pandemic, with the shutdowns of our industry. They spent a lot of money. And so now there's a big budget problem. And predictably, the Republicans leading the way, there are efforts to cut back government spending to get the budget back to where it was. But the alternative remains. The other way to get your budget better off would be to raise taxes. Then you don't have to cut spending because you've improved your budget by bringing in more money. Well, you can't tax the mass of people. They don't have the money. They're at the limit of taxation. The people who can best pay more taxes are corporations and the rich, the one who have been able to get out of paying their fair share for decades. So the alternative is always get more taxes from the rich. But mostly our politicians, Democrat and Republican alike, don't have the courage to do it. So they go in for austerity, whether they call it that or not. They cut back social programs. You know, food support, health support, educational support, transportational support, you name it, they cut it back. Some more, some less. So people are helped a lot less. People who need mental health counseling are helped a lot less. People with all kinds of health problems are helped a lot less. And guess what? Those people sometimes go over the edge. They can't handle the problems they have without the help they had become dependent upon. Help from the government that made all the difference in the world, that's being cut back. And so they act out on one another mostly, on themselves secondarily, and then sometimes in the public where they encounter the police. And as the problems get worse, the police and the pressure on the police gets worse. You have a disaster coming down the pike. And whether it happens in Memphis, Tennessee, as it recently did to the horror of the whole world, or in 1,000 events that are not reported on, yeah, policing and the agony of it and the excesses of it, those are a consequence of solving budgetary problems by really hurting masses of people with an austerity program rather than taxing the richest amongst us who've done the best in the last 40 years, but still don't want to pay, even at the price of the horror of a society afflicted by excess policing. If interventions like this strike you as valuable parts of the national conversation, then please partner with us. Share with us the process of bringing such videos to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers. You can also help us extend our reach by going to YouTube and hitting that little button. Doesn't cost anything to subscribe and be informed of what we do and what videos, for example, you might help distribute around. And for all your support and your interest, thank you.